So today I want to talk about front end alignment on the Jeep JLU, specifically the 2023 JLU that I own, but this goes for everything. Let's talk about toe, let's talk about camber, and let's talk about caster. I'm going to dive into all three of these things today, how to adjust them, how to measure them, and why you should care. Let's do this. So a long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, just kidding, when I was in my 20s, well, even before that, when I was in my teens, I used to work at a shop doing front end alignment on pretty much everything. Actually, we did rear end alignment, front end alignment. We did alignment on everything that had 4 wheels, sometimes 6 wheels, 8 wheels. It was a small town in Santa Maria, California. I worked out for a guy by the name of Dale Ruskoff, and he owned a shop called Dale's Alignment and Brakes. And we used to do service on fleets for U.S. Postal Service, UPS, just local consumers. We would align cars for the local racetrack. And I did a lot of experimenting. I did a lot of learning. And that guy taught me everything he knew. And he had been aligning cars for many years before I started. So hopefully I can impart some of that wisdom on you guys today. Although the tools have changed, we used to use bubble gauges and scuff gauges back in the day, and now they use lasers. But the fundamentals haven't changed. The mechanics of it haven't changed. The way you measure it changed, but that's about it. All right, let's start with camber and get that out of the way. Why don't people talk about camber when they're talking about Jeeps very much? Well, there's a reason for that. Camber isn't something you can adjust on a stock Jeep axle. So on this, we've got Dana 44s, and the ball joints are really stationary. Now, there are solid axles out there that allow you to adjust the camber, but those require that you have a kingpin in the upper ball joint and lower ball joint. And that allows you to swivel a small little cam-like device inside there and dial in the actual camber. Now, what is camber? Camber is the amount at which the top of the tire leans either in or out on the front end, okay? So if you think about that, if the tire leans in at the top, that's going to be called negative camber. If the tire leans out, that's positive camber. Now, you're going to be close to 0 camber on your stock Jeep axle, and if you're not, you got a problem. If you've got negative camber, which could happen, that means something's bent, right? Your axle's bent, your C is bent, something's wrong, or you could have a worn out ball joint that is causing the tire to lean in at the top. Now, imagine going down the road with a worn out ball joint. If you've got a slight toe, and I'll come back to toe in a second, if you got toe in and you're going down the road, it's going to pull the bottom of the tires in, and that worn out ball joint will let the tire fall out at the top. Vice versa, if you're toed out, it would suck the bottom of the tires out as you go forward, and that would push the top in, right, or suck the bottom out and cause negative camber. Why do we care about camber though? What does camber do? Well, camber can contribute to tire wear. So if I have negative camber and the tire's leaning in, the inside of the tire would be worn more. Or if I have positive camber, the tire leans out, the outside of the tire can wear more. And you can see that in cars that have negative camber on purpose for some reason. Race cars often have a lot of negative camber. So it creates uneven tire wear. The other thing camber can do is cause a pull to one side. If the tires are leaning one way, the Jeep is, or the vehicle is going to want to turn that way. So those are the key things with regards to camber. Now, again, like I said, we can't adjust camber on a Dana 44 axle, right? It's just not something you can do. And so we're not going to spend a lot of time on this topic. But the things you can adjust, like toe and caster, let's spend some good time talking about that. Caster, what is it? So you have an upper and a lower ball joint behind the wheel, which is what the wheel spins on, right? This is what allows you to steer the Jeep. If you drew a straight line through those 2 points, through those 2 ball joints, you're going to have what is determines your caster. So caster going back towards the driver is positive caster. Caster going away from the driver is negative caster. You should never have negative caster. Think of a shopping cart. Shopping cart has negative caster, right? The wheel's behind the actual leading point where they mount. You want positive caster, but how much? Typically what you're looking for is about 6 degrees of caster. We'll get into how to measure that in a minute. So unlike toe and camber, caster cannot affect tire wear. No amount of caster is going to cause your tires to wear unevenly or anything like that. However, it can have a huge effect on drivability. So caster is very important for a couple of reasons. One is having good caster, when you turn the wheel and you turn around a corner and you let go of the wheel spins back to center. It wants to return to center. That's because of caster. Now, too little caster and the wheel won't want to return to center, right? The steering will feel really light, but it won't want to track straight down the road. So the vehicle may wander back and forth, or it'll get into a groove and want to follow the groove in the road. You don't want that. You want the vehicle to track nice and straight down the road. So we want positive caster. That positive caster today, like I said, about 6 degrees is what you're looking for in a Jeep. But too much caster can make the steering feel very heavy and make the power steering work harder. So again, we don't want too much caster. Now, a lot of people will confuse caster and pinion angle. They are not the same. They are tied together, however. So they're usually tied together through a degree of separation. So if you have a given caster angle and you increase that, you also increase your pinion angle because the two are part of the same axle and they're inseparable. Now, a Jeep will usually have a degree of separation of about 6 degrees. So if your pinion angle is at 0, you're going to have about 6 degrees of caster. Some axles are different. Some have as much as 10 degrees of separation. It just depends on the axle you have. But in a Dana 44, like what we're looking at here, it's almost always exactly 6 degrees of separation, and it comes that way from the factory. The other thing too is you dial the caster back. As I said, pinion angle and caster are tied together. So as I move the pinion angle back, I'm changing as I move the caster back, I'm changing that pinion angle. And we don't want that pinion angle to be too drastic, right? We definitely don't want it pointing downhill. Now, I'll talk about the importance of pinion angle and its relationship to the transfer case as well, because that's also important and can cause other vibrations. Okay, so remember I talked about the actual pinion angle here coming out of the differential and its relationship to the drive shaft here. The angle of change coming out of the pinion to the drive shaft should be on a front end the same as the angle of the drive shaft going into the transmission, but it'll be the opposite angle. Why is that? Well, if those two angles are different, you get a vibration. Something else that caster can contribute to if you have too little caster is it can be one of the contributors to something known as death wobble. Jeep owners are familiar with this. If you don't have enough caster and you do have something loose in the suspension somewhere, we all know that it just takes one bump to kick it off, right? It's like a shopping cart with a wobbly wheel. At the certain speed, and there's an imperfection in the tire, maybe the tire's out of balance, or something is loose like a ball joint is worn out or a steering linkage connection is worn out, that can definitely contribute to death wobble, but too little caster can also contribute to that as well, or exacerbate the issue. Now, when we lift our Jeep, you can imagine with the control arm, as we raise the Jeep, the point that it attaches to doesn't change, but we rotate down as we go. Now, if the control arms stay the same and we rotate down, that's going to change the amount of caster we have. So adjustable control arms are really imperative when you're adding any kind of lift to the Jeep, because you want to be able to return that caster to where it needs to be. And you can only do that if you have an adjustable control arm. All right, so how do we measure caster? Now, if you take it to an alignment shop, they've got some pretty amazing tools to do this. They'll put it on a rack, they can rotate the tire and check the caster. But there's another place that you can do it at home in your own garage. There's a couple of spots. If you look at your axle, and they come this way from the factory, but you'll see two locations, here and here. Those two holes are actually used in the factory where the axle is made to be able to spread the case and insert all of your bearings and your locker and all those moving parts inside. But this flat surface in front of it that's on here is actually a really good location to check your caster. If you have an angle finder, and I have a digital one, so you might have an analog one that puts on there and you got to be able to read the needle, you can actually put your angle finder on that spot and it will give you a reading. Now, something important to mention here, you got to be sitting on a flat surface. Now, I know in my garage I've measured it, and the amount of change from one end to the other is roughly ½ degree. So what I'm doing, depending on whether I'm forward or backward in the garage, I'm going to either add or subtract that ½ degree from what I'm seeing here. Okay, so remember, I have a 0.5 degree from the floor alone that I would need to add back because I am backed into my garage. Now, if I put this up here and we're sitting at about ½ degree here. Now, which way is that going? If I tilt it out this way, it's positive. If I tilt it back this way, it's negative. So I'm actually sitting at about ½ degree of negative camber. Interesting. So now, if I go ahead and add back the ½ degree that I'm missing, that would put me, from the floor, that would put me at 0. And if I am 0 here, I'm going to be at exactly 6 degrees at the ball joints. So I'm sitting at 6 degrees of caster, which is perfect. All right, so let's say I had to adjust the caster today. I don't, but if I did, this is where I'm going to adjust the caster. Now, this is an adjustable lower control arm from my Metal Cloak 3.5-inch Game Changer. Love this lift kit, by the way. It's freaking amazing suspension. The way I would do that is bust the nut loose first, and I would do one side at a time, because if I remove both sides, if I don't have some kind of a ratchet strap holding the axle where it is, it's going to want to flop forward on the upper control arms. We don't want that to happen. It'd be tough to recover from. And then the other thing I want to do is when I'm doing that adjustment is I'm going to want the vehicle to be sitting exactly at ride height. Because if the front end is high, that's going to give me a false reading of too much. If it's sitting low, it's going to give me a false reading of too little. So we want to put the axle on jack stands at ride height, make our adjustments, and continue to measure the caster until we get it right. And the way we do that is break the nut loose, take the bolts out of the control arm, adjust this out to increase caster, and screw it in to decrease caster. And that's how you would do your adjustment. Let's talk about toe. Toe in, toe out, and what do you want and why do you care? So, toe in would be the tires pointing in towards each other going down the road. Toe out would be the tires pointing away from each other going down the road. Typically with a solid axle front end like our Jeep JLU here, we're going to want somewhere between a 16th and an 1/8 inch of toe. What does toe do? So there's two things. There's drivability aspects and tire wear aspects. On the drivability side, toe in will actually give you a little more stability. The vehicle will feel more stable going down the road. Whereas toe out, it does a lot of what we talked about with regards to caster. If you have too little caster, the vehicle's going to want to wander. Well, guess what? Toe out can make the vehicle want to feel darty and wander as well. Believe it or not, in racing, sometimes we want toe out. It makes it turn in really hard in the corners and things like that, but this is not a race car. We're looking for really good tire wear and really good drivability. Now on the tire wear side of the aspect, if the toe is too far in, it can wear and feather on the outside of the tire. If the tire is tires are towed out, you may get wear and feathering on the inside of the tire. Now that also depends on camber too, but remember, we're going to be close to 0 here. So we want the tires to wear a long time. We don't want to be wearing our tires out. So we're going to want to shoot for roughly about a 16th to an 1/8 of an inch of toe in on a Jeep like this. So how do we measure toe accurately at home in a garage? When I was really young as a kid, we used a thing called the scuff gauge. You used to drive over and it would move some things and you could determine what the toe was. Nowadays they use lasers and things like that at some of the alignment shops, which are obviously very accurate. But I'm going to show you guys a simple little way to do this with just some levels. Magnetic levels are great because they can actually stick to the rotor itself like this, with a little help of a clamp, of course. But before we get started with that, there's a couple things I want to point out. First, we need to get the vehicle up and the tires off, but I want this sitting as close to ride height as possible, because if the front end is up and I set these levels level, I'm not going to have an exact reading on the toe perfectly. Now, with a solid axle, that doesn't matter quite as much, right? Because ultimately what we're going on is a tie rod that connects this side of the right wheel to the left wheel. And that tie rod, the length of it, is going to determine my toe in and toe out. Because as I shorten this, it will toe the tires in, and as I lengthen it, it will toe the tires out. And so with a solid axle, we just need to get it up in the air, get the tires off, and then I'll show you guys how to do this. Because with the Jeep, we actually have a bolt holding the rotor firmly to the hub, and we can see that there is no play in the hub, right? Now, if my ball joints were worn out, this would be a problem, but we know that this is solid, right? We know the rotor is flat, we know the rotor is connected to the hub correctly. What I want to be able to do is take and put this on a flat surface. Now, you know, if we were out here on this surface, it would be great, but look, we've got a caliper impeding us here. We don't want that. That's going to give us a false reading. So we could go up here onto the hub flange, right? And that would put us out far enough, but it's kind of difficult to hold that on there. What you can do is go straight to the rotor face, just like that. And the thing almost wants to stick on there by itself because it's magnetic, but it won't quite stay there. So I'm going to give it a little help. And all I'm going to do is use a couple of clamps. If you don't have these, you might have something else laying around, but we can clamp this, give it a little help right to the rotor. Make sure we're sitting nice and level on the bubble here, just like that. And now I am flat against the rotor surface. And that gives me a really good reading for the toe on this side. Now I'll go set up one on the other side as well. There you go. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and put one tape measure behind and one tape measure in front. And I'm going to want to go about a foot from the center of the hub back and about a foot from the center of the hub forward for my second tape. And then we'll compare the two measurements. A couple of things that are really important here. One, we want our steering wheel perfectly centered, right? At least for the measurement. Now, if your steering wheel isn't centered going down the road, that's an adjustment that we can actually make later on once we have the toe set. But as I mentioned before, we're going to want to be about 1 foot back. So I made a mark, as you can see here. We'll put it right at 1 foot, and then 1 foot forward on the front one. You see my mark. And the reason for that is that we don't want an angle here of our tape measures. We want a true measurement directly straight across from one wheel to the other. So if I put my tape measures here on this side, right on those marks as well, you can see I have a mark here, and then I have a mark back here at 1 foot. Put them right on, and we can go ahead and look at our measurement. 68. We're sitting at almost exactly 68 inches in the back, and in the front, we're actually sitting at about 68 and a 16th. Not good. Remember, we want a 16th of an inch toe in. Because we're larger in the front right now, that would imply we're at about a 16th of an inch toe out. We want to adjust that. So let's figure out how do we adjust that. I'll walk you through it. We've got the Metal Cloak HD steering system. Now, if this was a stock steering system, it'd be a little different. There'd be a clamp here. We'd have to turn the clamp. In this situation, we're going to be loosening the nut at both ends, one here and one at that end, and we're going to be trying to shorten the tie rod by turning that. And we just need to loosen our steering dampener as well so that we can turn it freely without that holding us back. All right, so 3/16 Allen wrench. Okay, so once we have the tie rod ends loose at both ends, just like that, now what we can do is we can actually take and rotate the tie rod to the place that we need it. And we've also got this loosened up as well so that it can move freely. If we want to shorten this, we're going to rotate the tie rod forward. Remember, we got to go about 1/8 of an inch. So let's see how this goes. Let's check that. I think I'll go just a little bit more, about 1/4 turn. Let's check it again. All right, so after that adjustment, we're at about 68 1/8 in the rear. And in the front, we are just a big 68, between 68 and 68 1/16. So that looks really good, guys. I think I'm gonna leave it there. Okay, so it's important to note, when we go to tighten these back up again, what's gonna happen is it's gonna push outward a little bit. I know it sounds crazy, but it can actually lengthen it just a tad. So I think we're well within where we need to be, so we should be good to go. I'm gonna tighten these up now. Okay, so something I want to mention real quick. I did this kind of with a method that a lot of people may just have lying around. They do make tools that do essentially what these levels are doing now, and they bolt directly to the lug bolts here. And you can purchase those online, even at Amazon, for probably 60 bucks or something like that. And if you think you're going to need to do this for yourself, that's well worth it if you consider the cost of going to get your vehicle aligned. So another important aspect of front end alignment is going to be your steering wheel as well. You want that thing really centered going down the road. Now we just made a small, minute adjustment to our toe. So that can actually impact that, because when you do that, you're moving your tie rod, which really is now going to take and adjust the left tire in relation to the right, because the right tire is connected through a drag link to the actual steering box. That doesn't change, but if we lengthen the tie rod, that moves the left tire in slightly, which could cause this to want to actually be slightly to the left now when we drive it. So what we'll do is we'll check that by driving it. Now, if we determine we need to adjust that, the way we would do that is similar to what we did with the tie rod, is we would come in here. We have our drag link that goes from the pitman arm right here on the steering gearbox and goes all the way across to the passenger side wheel. If we determine for some reason that we need to make that adjustment, we would loosen this nut, and then we would turn this in or out depending on which way we need the steering wheel to go. But my guess is that I don't know that we made a big enough change today. We'll test it out. Okay, so to do this test to see if the steering wheel is actually straight, I always recommend that you get on a stretch of highway. Freeway is usually the best, because what you don't want to be doing is countering for the crown in the road. All roads have a crown, right? So you're always going to be driving on the right hand side in the US, and that means you're going to be counter steering to the left because the crown is going to lean to the right for drainage. There's that, and then the other thing too is it's probably not a great idea to do this particular test on a really windy day when you get on the freeway and the wind could be pushing you in one direction or another. You want to have a pretty mild day if possible, and again, no crown in the road. So let's hop in the freeway and see how this does. Alright, I'm gonna go ahead and hop into the center lane here. The road actually gets a little bumpy up here in just a second, but I'm looking at it right now and I think we're looking pretty good. Again, the road's kind of leaning a little to the left here. Let's get to a straight section right here. Wow, guys, that looks pretty darn good. Tracking nice and straight. Steering wheel is straight. I dig it. I think we're in a good spot. All right, so now we're on a 2-lane road that's got some off camber sections and things like that, and definitely a little bit of crown in the road. But as you can see, the Jeep is tracking really good. Steering wheel nice and straight. Here the road's really leaning to the left a little bit, but still tracking really straight at this speed, about 50 miles an hour, 47. So again, I really like where we're at. The Jeep is handling really good. Now, there's something you'll notice. Every once in a while I'll hit a bump and the steering wheel will kind of do a little bump. That's something called bump steer, and I want to talk about that a little bit. Let's talk about bump steer. If you've lifted your Jeep and you didn't compensate for the angle of the drag link, you're going to have bump steer. There's no way around it. Why does it happen? Well, you'll see the drag link that comes from the tie rod over here next to where the tie rod mounts on the knuckle on the right, and you follow it along and it comes all the way up here to the pitman arm at the steering gearbox. Now, you'll notice it's sitting at a different angle than the tie rod, which is flat and level. That angle, every time the right tire moves up in the suspension travel, it's going to push on that rod. Now, the steeper this angle gets, the worse your bump steer is going to get. Now, you can see I have a 3.5-inch lift, and we're clearly not at the same angle as the tie rod, which is level, or the axle. So every time that right tire moves up in this direction, it's going to want to push the pitman arm and therefore the steering linkage, and you feel that in the steering wheel as feedback from the road. Now, they do make devices. For instance, you can get a high steer knuckle, right? Where this particular part of the knuckle, where the drag link mounts, is at a higher location, which makes the steering a little more level. By raising this end, it brings it more in line with the steering gearbox and pitman arm over here, right? You could get a dropped pitman arm, which puts a lot of strain on the steering gearbox. But if your bump steer isn't that bad, I wouldn't worry about it. I just want to make it clear that if you're not level here, you're always going to have bump steer. All right, so quick chat. What did we learn today? Camber, unless you got kingpins and an aftermarket axle, there's really nothing you can do about it on a Jeep. Caster, you can only adjust that if you have adjustable control arms, top or lower, upper or lower, it doesn't matter, either one. You can then adjust your caster. If it's a factory ride height and you still have a caster problem, something's definitely wrong there. You might want to have that looked at. But if you've lifted your Jeep like I have, and you don't have adjustable control arms, that's going to be a problem. Get yourself some adjustable lower control arms so you can dial in the camber, or caster, excuse me. Toe in, super easy to adjust. Anyone can do that at home, right? You do have to pull the wheels off, you got to have a way to measure it, and you got to have 2 straight edges that you can line up and use so you can get an accurate measurement. And we're shooting for between a 1/16 and an 1/8 of an inch of toe, right? So to recap, the Jeep drives freaking amazing. I hear a lot of people say, I hate the way the Jeep drives. Look, a Jeep is never gonna drive like a Mercedes. But I've had a Mercedes, I've had a Tesla, I've had really nice driving cars. And although my Jeep rides a little bumpy, it doesn't dart all over the road or give me fits steering or driving, and I don't get a lot of road fatigue driving it. So these adjustments, once you get them in line, your Jeep should drive really well, and you shouldn't have anything like death wobble. So hopefully you guys learned something today. If you did, hit the like button and subscribe, and reach out to me if you need help with your own alignment. I'd be happy to reach out to me in the comments. I'd be happy to give you guys any help I can. All right, take care, guys.